Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
The erosion of civil rights in the United States, not just in 2025 with the election of the Republican Party for the presidency, as well as both houses of Congress, but historically, especially since the 1980s, since the Reagan administration, has been a phenomenon that has been taking place at the same time as we have seen the rise of hybrid authoritarianism in America, coming to, of course, the evolving stage that it has in 2025, 2026 now, under an administration that openly praises policies that are characteristics of authoritarian regimes. Hybrid authoritarianism simply refers to a government which has an electoral system. It has elections. However, the people choose from political class, from the establishment political class, both in the case of the United States, Democrats and Republicans, financed by Wall Street, for the most part, not all of them, but most of them, and cater in terms of public policy back to the elites of Wall Street and are accountable to them. The result of a neoliberal class warfare. The neoliberal political project has been around since the late 70s, Jimmy Carter and the antecedents for that. And it continued, it was institutionalized in the 1980s, and it continued during the Clinton decade of the 90s and onwards to the present. No matter what either party or any president says, the fact is that neoliberalism, namely institutionalizing more deregulation of business, shifting resources, taxpayer money, from social welfare and social safety net programs, including health, education, housing, all kinds of social assistance programs, into corporate welfare to buttress the corporate sector, lowering taxes of the richest Americans and corporations. Okay, that it has been, and bailing out, by the way, bailing out banks, insurance companies, big companies, as we saw, big corporations, we saw in the Great Recession of 2008. That has been all part of the neoliberal project. Now, because the neoliberal project in its core entails class war, a struggle by the capitalist class against the worker and the middle class, there has been necessarily an attack on the civil rights movement as well, on civil rights legislation that has been watered down and has eroded. So the rights of minorities, the civil rights of minorities erosion, has been taking place at the same time as the lowering, the diminution, in other words, the level of democracy in America has diminished and authoritarianism has been rising. This is not to argue that a single person, namely Donald Trump, or even that the Republican Party alone, all by themselves, are doing this because of ideological predisposition, and that there is no other reason other than the ideology which camouflages the tangible interests resting behind the ideology. The reality is that civil rights has been eroding slowly over decades, and it did not just happen in 2025 when Trump came to office on January 20th, 2025. The reality is also that the civil rights erosion has not been confined to government policy pertaining to federal workers, as when Trump announced, for example, when he came to office, that he would get rid of affirmative action as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. In other words, a direct attack on minorities, and removed through Elon Musk's Doge group, the group that was assigned to get rid of so-called surplus workers in the federal workforce, get rid of federal workers. The fact is that many of them were disproportionately minorities, especially Black women, by the way. Now, there have been public opinion polls and surveys conducted in the last 5 years about the erosion of civil rights in America. A survey of 500 political scientists in the United States found that this is indeed the case, and that there is a concomitant, in other words, a simultaneous drop in American democracy, liberal democracy, while there is a rise in discrimination at the expense of minorities, especially Blacks at the very top, Hispanics following. This is, again, not just with the administration of Trump, but it preceded. It's just that with the Trump administration, there was a more systematic attack. Behind the Trump administration's attack and behind the Trump administration's public policy, both domestic and foreign policy, is a document called Project 2025. Many people are familiar with it. You can Google it, it's all over the web. Project 2025 was put together by the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is a far right-wing group funded by billionaires. The expression for public policy in Project 2025 is the desire of the billionaires to advance both their interests, the interests of Wall Street, and their ideology. In this document, we have the blueprint for the erosion of civil rights. So the fact is that it is not necessarily the political class doing anything on its own, but rather handed a prescription of what public policies to follow, both domestic and foreign policies. It is also the case that you cannot separate the erosion of democracy from the erosion of civil rights. The two go together. The rise of authoritarianism has entailed in the United States the decline of civil rights. Americans, by a very large percentage, believe that, in fact, the United States has slipped toward authoritarianism. Authoritarianism and racism, according to one poll, 81% of those polled agree go together. Authoritarianism and racism do go together. Another poll indicates, in fact, it was in 2020, that racism, this is the year of the Trump, the last year that Trump was in office, before Biden came into office, racism was a serious problem. And 91% of the population believed that it was a serious problem. Another poll suggested that, a Gallup poll suggested that, this is a more recent poll, 2/3 of the American people believe racism with blacks, again, and Hispanics, not necessarily all ethnic groups, all minority groups, but blacks at the very top. The majority of Americans polled recognize that the blacks are the most discriminated at the top. Hispanics follow closely behind, especially during the Trump administration's anti-immigrant policy. Then Asians, then Native Americans. Now, we go all the way down to the Jewish minority, which is roughly 2% of the population, a little bit less than that, actually. And the reason I mention this is because the government itself has used, and institutions, private institutions, anti-Semitism as a violation of minority rights against the Jews for those who are against the war in Gaza, the genocide campaign in Gaza that had been taking place. Okay. In other words, if you're against the war in Gaza, against the civilians, that means you're anti-Semitic. So you're against that minority. Although the majority of the American people, I underscore, according to public opinion polls, historically down to today, believe it's blacks who are the most discriminated, followed by Hispanics. Now, for another minute or so to stay on this issue of public opinion polling, it's also the case that the majority of the American people believe the United States is indeed slipping toward authoritarianism. 41% of the American people have come to more or less accept some form of authoritarianism if it means, as they believe, it may solve some of their problems. Okay, so authoritarianism, hybrid authoritarianism, in other words, there are still elections, there's still a Congress, they still have a press, it's not necessarily free, it is reflecting the views of Wall Street and the government represents Wall Street. It is hybrid authoritarianism. And this hybrid authoritarianism has become the norm. And more people see it as, well, that's how it is. That's the new reality. The attack on civil rights has been over decades, and it has become very evident it became very evident in 2025 because of the attack on the migrants, the undocumented workers, which of course the government calls illegal aliens and criminals, okay, the undocumented workers. But along with that particular group, the fact is any dissident, as well as blacks, as even Native Americans, by the way, unbelievable that the Homeland Security, the police, the ICE police agents have gone after Native Americans in their hunt for targets. As ironic as that seems, of course, they have argued that this is to make America safe and secure from minorities, from working people, attacking even white dissidents, killing white dissidents in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just recently, by the way, a man and a woman, and arguing that the victim was the perpetrator, the victim, was at fault for being shot by ICE agents. In both cases, by the way. Now, discrimination must be seen, racial discrimination, erosion of civil rights in America must be seen, and scholarly literature, of course, does see it, not all of it, a lot of scholarly literature places it in the framework of an integral part of a class-based society, of capitalism. Historically, racism starts with the transatlantic slave trade in the Western world 500 years ago. The rise of the transatlantic slave trade coincides with the rise of the commercial revolution in Europe and the industrial revolution of England in the 18th century. The slave trade itself and slave labor in the Western Hemisphere, from the United States down to Brazil, helped to strengthen industrial capitalism, because slave labor, although not cheap labor, although not free labor, it's cheap labor, it's the cheapest form of labor, as inhumane as it is, and it helped to provide the highest profits at the lowest possible cost. So the fact is that to justify slave labor, they used the color of the skin of people that white Europeans transported into the Western Hemisphere as a pretext to exploit their labor. So this is a class issue in this respect. Historically, in the United States, as well as outside the United States, African American as well as African descendant intellectuals who looked at this issue have indeed linked class and race. This includes Martin Luther King toward the end of his life, Malcolm X, Du Bois in the 100 years before Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Frantz Fanon, who came out of the Caribbean, worked in Algeria, for example. All of these people were well aware of the relationship of class and race, all of them. They knew about the exploitation, the exploitative aspect of race, that race was used, institutionalized racism was used to camouflage, to justify the exploitation of the person with a darker skin by the whites, the white capitalists. The integration of Blacks in America has been an ongoing project, a project that has evolved from the end of the Civil War in the mid 1860s to the present. And it was, of course, a project intended to realize the principles of the American Constitution: all men are created equal. The 18th century principles of democracy and social justice. Those principles were relegated to the white elites, did not include slaves, and then the freedmen, the people who became free, and it did not include Native Americans, by the way, whose land was taken away from them and they were put in reservations. It did not include Asian Americans in the 19th century. It did not include many workers. It did not include women. So what we have is a highly hierarchical society reflecting the social structure, the class structure of a country under the political economy of capitalism, where the few profited at the expense of the many. The Blacks were at the very bottom of the social ladder, even after gaining their freedom. The fact is, there was a long road to securing civil rights from the 1860s to the 1960s, from the period of from Lincoln's assassination to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, a long road to achieving civil rights. And to this day, the fact is that minorities, blacks at the very top, Hispanics, as I said, following close behind, have been discriminated institutionally. It isn't just the government, but what the government does filters down to all levels of society. It filters down to the education system, where blacks were historically excluded from many universities, from entering universities, okay, from securing black professors, from securing positions in universities. Historically discriminated in the healthcare system, receiving, when you look at statistics, comparing the healthcare system of whites versus blacks, blacks are at the very bottom in terms of receiving quality healthcare. When you look at the sector of housing, the black population in America, which is, by the way, roughly 15% of the population in the United States, is at the very bottom, the worst housing, okay? So institutionally, jobs in terms of money earned for the same job, there is a gap between white versus black. It had closed after the civil rights movement somewhat, okay, just like it closed somewhat for women versus men. However, there was still a gap. This institutional discrimination reflects a hierarchical society which provided an ideology to justify the exploitation of people with different skin color. The question, of course, today is, how is the United States using an attack on civil rights to justify the class warfare intended to camouflage the transfer of income from the bottom up, from the working class and the middle class to capital? The transfer of trillions. In 2017, when Donald Trump was president his first term, he transferred 2 trillion from, of course, most of that went to public debt, into the pockets. That money was transferred into the pockets of corporate America and the wealthiest Americans, the richest 5%, as Senator Bernie Sanders calls them, the oligarchy. In 2025, there was another transfer of money, this time a much higher, 4.5 trillion. Much of that went to the pockets, into the pockets of the so-called corporate welfare pool, namely in tax reductions and in corporate subsidies for the richest Americans. Again, strengthening the oligarchy, to use Senator Sanders as well as others. Others use that term as well, by the way. What we have seen is, as the socioeconomic gap has risen in America, and this is not just now with the Republicans. When we look at government statistics as well as private sector statistics from 1980 to the present, we see that wages have dropped, real wages in terms of purchasing power parity have dropped in America. And we have seen a huge rise in the last 45 years in income concentrated in the richest 5%, and within that 5%, the richest 1%. So we have seen massive transfer of income. And with that socioeconomic inequality, we have witnessed the rise of racial inequality and ethnic inequality. So it is not surprising that there has been an attack on civil rights, and that the Republican Party, especially, has decided to use civil rights as a pretext to defend the arguing that the rights of the majority, the white majority, must be protected. In fact, President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance have castigated repeatedly foreign leaders, as well as domestically, of course, anyone defending affirmative action and civil rights. They regard the term social justice as an anathema. Social justice, which they identify with socialism and communism, by the way, has its roots in Christianity. When we look at the concept of social justice, it comes out of the Christian tradition. It comes out of the tradition from the works of intellectuals like Thomas More in England, in 16th century England, and the writings of Thomas Mutzer in Germany, the disciple of Martin Luther, who led the peasants, the German Peasants' War in 1524. This is social justice is a concept which comes out of the idea of Christian egalitarianism. Long before 19th century socialism and Marxism and anarchism, syndicalism, these varieties of left-wing ideologies, social justice predates secular ideologies of the 19th century. It has its roots in Christianity. But today, right-wing Christian nationalists, white supremacist nationalists, are affirming a new ideology, the ideology of the rights of the white supremacist. In fact, the Trump administration has made it a point to criticize President Ramaphosa in South Africa for attacking white Afrikaners. Afrikaners, just for the record, are these are whites, descendants of the Dutch colonists in South Africa, who had their ancestors, their predecessors, before Nelson Mandela in 1990. These are the people who were behind the apartheid regime of South Africa. Okay, so the president of the United States is accusing the black majority government of South Africa of not defending the rights of Afrikaners, of attacking them, in fact, of even committing genocide, although no one in the world accepts that, by the way. The United States also is lecturing the Europeans, European liberal elements, politicians and governments, to defend far right-wing groups, also white supremacists, who are anxious about more migrants coming from Africa and from the Middle East, from the Arab countries in South Asia. Okay, so the white supremacist ideology, Christian ideology, for the most part, there are also Zionist elements in there, is prevalent. Now, it isn't just the government, though, that's pushing this. The fact is that the United States courts have legitimacy, given their stamp of legitimacy. If a court says this is legal, then it becomes the norm. People accept it. Well, it's legal, therefore it must be the norm. It must be natural. So the courts, from lower courts all the way to the Supreme Court, have undermined in the United States the civil rights movement by using civil rights law to to defend corporate America and to undermine the rights of minorities in affirmative action cases and in redistricting in elections so that the white population secures elected representatives in Congress. This is the manipulation of the electoral system. The question is, one question, there are many, of course, is why is all this happening? There are 15%, as I pointed out, 15% of the population of the United States is Black, 19% is Hispanic. Within the next 20, 25 years, 30 perhaps, the minority population of the United States, which is now roughly 35%, will become the majority, will become over 50%. So what we can have possibly in the United States is a situation like South Africa before Nelson Mandela, before 1990. And this is something that creates anxieties among the white elites because they are concerned about their status, their privileged status in society. To what degree will they preserve that status if at the leadership there are elected officials who represent minorities, and within that minority, the working class, which is going to demand that their interests are furthered, not just the interests of Wall Street, but the interests of all people, the interests of the middle class and the working class. So in part, this is the issue. When we look at at discrimination in the United States by the numbers, when we look at statistics, it has indeed worsened, especially since the 2008 Great Recession, and really taken a downturn during the COVID-19 pandemic after 2020, and now with an administration in the United States that follows the Project 2025 principles, the Heritage Foundation's blueprint of public policy that is against civil rights, against affirmative action, against diversity, equity, and inclusion. We see that for example, that the debt of blacks versus whites is far higher. We see that poverty is almost 3 times higher among blacks than it is among whites. We see that the blacks, although they're 15% of the population, own roughly 4% of all the wealth in the United States. We see that there are disparities in every sector, from college, postgraduate degrees in whites versus blacks to white executives versus black executives, for example, throughout the institutional structure. And after the Elon Musk group eliminated many federal jobs, it was an attack. On the black population because the federal government, federal jobs were an opening for upward social mobility for minorities in America. And what the Trump administration did is it closed that door. It used the idea of a wasteful bureaucracy, which, by the way, is going to become even more wasteful when they bring Silicon Valley automation in with artificial intelligence and less efficient. It's going to become much more expensive for the taxpayer of the United States than it has been. But it used the pretext of waste and technology in order to attack minorities, in order to get rid of minorities. And many on the Republican side argue, well, this is the natural voting base ever since FDR of the Democratic Party. So why not? They don't vote Republican anyway. The vast majority vote Democrat, or they stay home. So that is another dimension of this. That is indeed another dimension of this. Now, in the civil rights movement of the it started in the 1950s, but it took off. It really took off in the 1960s. At the center of that was Martin Luther King Jr., who came out of the tradition, the Black church tradition. Historically, just a word about that. Historically, whites during slavery and even post-slavery, by the way, only really allowed Black freedom within the confines of the church. It's about the only institution they permitted Blacks to have. And historically, the Black church was both a source of an outlet for spiritual salvation and by extensions, emancipation in this world as well. But it is out of the Black church that we have civil rights movement and resistance to oppression that has been the case in the United States throughout the history of the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. came out of that tradition, as many other civil rights leaders have as well. The idea behind the civil rights movement was never that it was just about Blacks. Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, later Jesse Jackson, and at the same time as Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, all of them realized that the civil rights movement had to be more universal, and that it was indeed part of class-based society and about capitalist exploitation. They knew that. The question is, to what degree did they opt for reform within the system, and to what degree did they opt for systemic change, radical change, to get rid of the system so that the minorities can experience true freedom in society, which was, for all practical purposes, a quasi-apartheid society, not that different from South Africa, by the way. Martin Luther King was influenced as much by Christian doctrine as he was by left-wing ideology. In the end, he leaned more toward the moral arguments for a socially just society. He was not blind to the reality that white America exploited Black labor at the bottom of the socioeconomic class, and that many whites, he was not blind to the reality, as many before him, by the way, Blacks and some whites, recognized that even the poor whites and the middle class whites were using the idea of racism because and when we're going along with it, because it had, not only because it had become the norm given the legacy of slavery and the legacy of segregation, but because they felt somehow better about themselves. At least they might not be rich, they might not have any creative expression, they may not have a big house and a big car and all of that, the comforts of life, but at least they were white. That gave them a sense of superiority. In other words, the skin color itself. The elites exploited that. The politicians who rode the wave to political office on the basis of underscoring racist messages, whether blatant or more subtly, they rode the wave. And the population to this day a segment of the population accepts that. Even during the um, uh, 1960s civil rights era, when public opinion polls were conducted, and the majority, by the way, went along with Martin Luther King because Martin Luther King embraced Mahatma Gandhi's um, peaceful resistance. No violence, non-violent resistance, no violence, demand on moral grounds the right to be a human being, just like whites, and to realize the principles of the Constitution in reality across all institutions, equal access to education, equal access to jobs, equal access to all aspects of life, from riding a bus and sitting wherever one wants to sit rather than the back of the bus, and drinking out of the same fountain as a white person. So the idea was equality as a human being, human dignity. This, of course, many whites, the majority, according to public opinion polls in the 1960s, accepted. And they accept it today. Theoretically, they accepted it then and today. In reality, they resented this idea. So they used when time came to implement this into policy through affirmative action, by the way, whites were resentful for this. They didn't want it. So the government, many in government, Democrats and Republicans, by the way, were from the local level, from the local level to state level to federal government level, did not vigorously push the agenda of civil rights. Today, what we have and what we have had in the last 10 years is actually a reversal of that, going back to pre-civil rights era, going back to the era of Jim Crow laws, the era, not exactly laws legislated, but the era of using merit-based or meritocracy system to camouflage doing away with affirming the civil rights of minorities. And of course, in the case of in the case of Hispanics, as we have seen with ICE, literally using the term of illegal alien criminal to attack that minority, and along with them, anyone who resists using that attack, which is camouflaging authoritarianism in America and eroding the democratic process. So what we have in the United States today is indeed the intertwining of authoritarianism and the erosion of civil rights, because the society itself is headed toward full-fledged authoritarianism. The legacy of Martin Luther King has been diminished, severely diminished, because instead of moving forward and securing more civil rights and pursuing more equality, greater equality, institutionally, the United States is going back. Corporations as well as schools have used the signal from the federal government to be more relaxed about the enforcement of civil rights, because they know that the federal government, that the courts are not going to enforce it. In schools, There has been an attack in 44 out of the 50 states on curriculum and books that pursue race issues. 18 of the 50 states have already eliminated critical race theory and curriculum dealing and books dealing with critical race theory. Critical race theory may sound fancy. It's nothing more than simply looking at racism historically, holistically, all aspects of it, instead of isolating one issue and picking up cherry picking issues, looking at the whole issue of racism in terms of as an integral part of a political economy, culture, an integral part of a society with roots in slavery and in segregation, in lynchings of blacks, by the way, in burnings of black churches. So this is an attack on all of that. On all of that, this is the attack on critical race theory is an attack on analyzing how the reality of history has unfolded in America. This is exactly what critical race theory is. It is really an honest appraisal of what has unfolded. And the majority who oppose it argue that the sensibilities of the white population must be taken into account. In other words, it would be equivalent to arguing in South Africa that the sensibilities of the Afrikaners must be taken into account when looking at the history of apartheid in South Africa. The sensibilities of the Afrikaners today must be taken into account because they are sensitive to that sort of thing, that their ancestors were doing all these things, and that even today, Afrikaners are the privileged socioeconomic class in Black majority South Africa. So what we have is a society that is in fact very racialized. It has unfortunately not made as much progress as people want to believe, both whites and many blacks, by the way. They want to believe that America is a multicultural, open society, democratic, with social justice at its core, but it is not. The record shows that statistically. When you look at the record, when you look at poverty among minority populations, especially blacks, versus the majority white, but also when you look at poverty overall in America at around 12-13%, much higher, 20-21% among blacks, by the way. Okay. When you look at that, what you see is a very hierarchical society with social justice not on the radar screen at all. If it were on the radar screen, they would not be pursuing tactics, militarized police state tactics against their own citizens, let alone undocumented workers. So this is a very important consideration. The question is, where does America go from here as a society that is indeed multicultural by nature, a society that historically is a society of immigrants? The blacks were not voluntary immigrants. They were forced on slave ships to go across the Atlantic to become slaves for white plantation owners. Where is American society going? If we can't separate the issue of civil rights, the future of civil rights, from the issue of the future of democracy in America. They're intertwined. The future of democracy of America doesn't look good by anyone's measure. I should tell you, by the way, there have been studies by many organizations inside the United States and outside the United States about the erosion of civil rights. All of them reach a consensus. There has been an erosion of civil rights. They all agree, all of them. At the same time, there have been organizations that have done studies about democracy in America. All of them agree that there has been an erosion of democracy in America. At best, it's a flawed democracy. It is not Scandinavian country-style democracy, social democracy, or even New Zealand. It's not, or even Holland, by the way. It's not anywhere near that. It is hybrid authoritarian. Europeans now, over the issue of Greenland that the Trump administration wants, have now realized that indeed the authoritarian policies at home are reflected in the foreign policy, the aggressive imperialist style foreign policy abroad. So they now are concerned that that country over across the Atlantic is trying to encourage far right-wing elements across Europe. And they're concerned that the United States wants far right-wing elements from Latin America to Europe to Asia. And so we can't separate the issue of the rise of authoritarianism and the erosion of civil rights, because far right-wing elements, whether in the United States against Blacks and Latinos and Asians, are not that different from far right-wing elements in Europe against Africans and Arabs and Asians, right? So there is common ideological approach to this. The question is, who benefits from all this and who is harmed? Clearly, society as a whole is harmed. American society is harmed. More directly, the people at the very bottom are harmed. The working class, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Latinos, whites included, by the way. Okay, they're harmed. The beneficiaries are the elites that are using this issue as a distraction to continue to transfer taxpayer money from social safety net programs, social welfare programs, social safety net programs to corporate welfare. There have been, the media has been on the side of the institutional racist elements, arguing that it isn't right that there are states and cities providing aid to the children of immigrants who are undocumented. They have no problem transferring billions to bail out banks, insurance companies, and in terms of providing corporate subsidies to build stadiums for billionaire owners of sports clubs. They have no problem for that. But they have a problem feeding children because they happen to be of children of color and of another country. So the issue of racism and civil rights is used because there are people who are making money. There are tangible elements. The capitalist class from the long 16th century, as scholars call it, from 1450 to 1650, this is the long 16th century. This is when capitalism as a political economy consolidated. This is when we have the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as an institution. From that time to the present, the capitalist class has benefited from cheap labor, from the exploitation of cheap labor. So they use an ideological and cultural position and arguments of all sorts to justify the exploitation of those people by, well, they're inferior. What? Their skin color is different. They don't have the same culture as we have. They're just not the same. So that means it's okay to exploit their labor. So this is where we're headed. We're headed toward this irrational road to systemic exploitation using race and ethnicity and religion, because this is an integral part of authoritarianism. I ask you to write comments, ask questions, and by all means join this channel. Thank you very much.